Are you ready for some good news about the economy? This is the Issues Watch podcast. Hi, I'm Don Meyer, Chief Marketing Officer at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the Issues Watch podcast. Many economists, CEOs, and CPAs had penciled in 2023 as the year when a recession would hit the American economy. In fact, in an NJCPA survey conducted a year ago, almost 70% of respondents believed that economic conditions in the United States would get worse in the second half of 2022. The thinking was that the US economy would grind to a halt because the Federal Reserve was effectively slamming the brakes to squash inflation. Businesses would lay off workers, and inflation-weary Americans would slash spending. But the case for a 2023 US recession is crumbling. Despite the banking crisis, rate hikes, and the debt ceiling, this economy is incredibly resilient. Even our notoriously pessimistic members are decidedly less pessimistic about the US economy for the rest of the year. With me to make sense of these economic predictions and discuss the NJCPA's latest economic survey is Roosevelt Bowman, a senior investment strategist with Bernstein Private Wealth Management. Roosevelt brings 20 years of experience in investment research and portfolio management with a focus on global fixed income, monetary policy, and data science. Welcome back to the podcast, Roosevelt.
Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate it.
So in this year's NJCPA economic survey, member sentiment was much less pessimistic about the prospects for the economy than they were in 2022. So this year, 47% of respondents expect the US economy to remain about the same the remainder of the year. And I know that doesn't sound great, but last year, 68% believed the economic conditions in the US would get worse over the remainder of 2022. So do CPAs have reason to be more optimistic or even less pessimistic about the US economy the rest of the year?
I think part of what's playing into that is that there were lots of recession calls and it hasn't come to fruition yet. We're still expecting pretty significant economic slowing over the next 6 to 9 months. But there's no doubt that the quote unquote kind of soft landing scenario is a lot higher probability than before. And I think a lot of times when we hear the word recession, we kind of harken back to the last couple of episodes, right? Just putting the pandemic aside, but 2008, the tech crisis in 99, I would argue those are very different scenarios than what we're looking at now. We're looking at more of your generic economic slowing and from a much better starting point in terms of the labor market. The unemployment rate is about 3.5%. That's much better than the normal level that you would see when the economy starts to slow. So, 99, 2008, those crises really had way too much leverage in a couple sectors. In 99, it was technology. 2008, obviously the housing sector. You're talking about trillions of dollars of derivatives that really fell the economic and financial system. That's thankfully not the case this time. We will see some pullback in terms of credit that's available because of banks and kind of the slowing economic activity that the Fed's trying to engineer to push inflation down. But again, our starting point's a lot better, and we don't have that same excess borrowing and leverage throughout the financial system that we saw in 99 and 2008.
So our members basically are saying status quo for the rest of 2023. From an economist standpoint, is that necessarily a bad thing, or is it if you're not growing, you're stagnating? But is status quo necessarily bad?
Yeah, I think we'd probably lean more towards some slowing, but slowing from a good starting point, right? And I think a couple of forward-looking indicators that I love to follow. The job market in terms of current data, it's still showing some pretty good resilience. But when you reference some of those forward-looking indicators that we've talked about in the past that I still love to follow, online job postings, that's showing kind of receding demand for labor. When you look at the ability to negotiate salary in new positions, right? The amount of people quitting versus those that are laid off. Before, that ratio was really big. You had a lot of people quitting and people were not being laid off. Now that ratio is falling. You're seeing, unfortunately, more layoffs, fewer people quitting. The power is shifting from the employee back to the employer some. So I think it's fair to expect not exactly status quo, some economic slowing, but again, from a pretty good starting point and more of that quote unquote normal economic activity kind of, falling back rather than something like a big crisis and a sharp fall off in growth.
So the only other word we've heard more than recession the last year or two is inflation.
Yeah.
So like last year, CPAs cited inflation as the biggest challenge for their businesses and for their clients.
Yeah.
So is inflation still the biggest concern for the economy, or are we suffering from a bit of a inflation hangover?
So I love being the bearer of good news. Inflation is still the main topic, but we're seeing some real progress on that front. I think number one, when you look at the kind of evolution of inflation, right? What drove it? Initially, it was the cost of goods being really elevated. The price of goods has come down. What food and energy that we all spend on every day, we've seen those prices of those commodities come back as global demand has kind of slowed, and monetary policy that's been tighter not only here in the U.S. but in developed nations as well has worked. Right, we're pushing down demand. That's alleviating some of that inflation pressure in terms of goods. We're starting to see a little bit of progress on the services side as well. And when we think about inflation, I know a lot of the numbers that get reported are the year over year. There's progress there. We may not see as much progress because when you think about a year over year number, you're comparing where we are in terms of price levels right now to 12 months ago. Some of those comparisons were very easy for the first part of the year because you had sky high inflation numbers last year. And so the year over year numbers, I'm not expecting that same progress. But more importantly, inflation is one of those data series that really does have momentum up or down. And so when you look at the last 3 or 4 months, we're seeing progress there in inflation. That I think is very encouraging to not only us as consumers and business people, but also the Federal Reserve. I don't think that the Fed is claiming victory yet. They certainly are still looking to be hawkish and really talk about raising rates, talk about keeping the policy rate around these levels for an extended period of time, because they want to make sure the progress continues. You know, it's not 4%, it's really 2% that they need to get inflation under their target. And they don't want to give up any of the gains by taking their foot off the gas pedal too early. But again, I think the news is positive there. We're not there yet, but it should be better conditions for all of us as kind of consumers and business people.
Well, that's good news. Yeah, definitely. So what are the prospects for inflation the rest of the year?
Yeah, so I think when we think about inflation, that kind of pace of the year-over-year changes, that'll slow, right? It may not look as impressive, but I do think the sort of main drivers of inflation, number one, when you think about some of those supply chain disruptions, there's been improvement there. And also, we do anticipate some slowing of the labor market. One thing that's important on the labor market is that there's a new study by the San Francisco Fed that just came out and talked about the fact that wages are not translating one-to-one into inflation. So the thesis that we have to have sizable job losses in a big-time recession just to get inflation down, that thesis has been proven wrong. And this is something that, you know, the Fed has talked about in the past. I've talked about it as well. And I think it's good to just, again, put some data around this current period that says, yes, we're going to need some slowing of the labor market, but it doesn't mean that we have to have significant job losses just to get inflation towards the Fed's 2% target. So again, I think more progress at the end of the year, but it's likely to be slow and it's going to be choppy. It's not the sort of process in our eyes where, oh, you're just going to move down by a steady amount each month. You're going to get to your 2% target really quickly. That's not likely. The economy is still on pretty solid footing. So we're going to have a bit of a choppy process. And, you know, in our eyes, we're not really going to get close to that 2% target until really towards the end of 2024.
Okay. And of course, there's a lot that the Fed either can't predict or can't control. So there's always those variables or those unknowns that can come into play.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So another thing that came up during the survey was the availability of skilled personnel. It was cited as the second biggest challenge for businesses, where it was also ranked in last year's survey. Is that a challenge we're simply going to have to adjust to? Is there really much at this point can be done about that availability of skilled personnel?
I do think that we can do something about it, and some of it is already starting to happen. So an interesting trend that we talked about a little bit before is that employers are shifting more towards hiring based on skills rather than experience. When you kind of look at some of the LinkedIn data around this, you're seeing employers shift. Why that's important is you end up with a more flexible, efficient labor market. So to use an example, you know, if you have someone who is pretty good at, you know, math, technical skills, previously they're pretty much going to be in one of our fields or maybe an engineer. Now that person can work at a healthcare startup. They can work in fashion because those other industries understanding the value of folks with higher level statistics, technical skills, programming expertise. So I do think the labor market is becoming more flexible. Some of that can be alleviated by looking for talent in areas and majors that maybe we weren't looking at before. But some of it is, Don, you and I have talked about kind of offline, is it will come through automation, right? You're able to at least enhance and make up for some of those skills shortfalls through some of those advanced mathematical techniques, whether they're machine learning or artificial intelligence. Now, the limit, of course, is your tools are only as good as the person using them. And I think that's where the understanding of the underlying concepts is really important. But if you can at least buy time to train some of these folks that maybe are from backgrounds that you might not have mined before, that is a way of dealing with that skills gap. But I do think it's an important one, and it won't be fixed immediately, but I do think there are some solutions there.
Yeah, and the AI discussion is an interesting one because on one side you have, let's say, CFOs are looking at AI to make them more efficient and make up for the lack of skilled personnel. But then you have another camp that says they're afraid that AI is going to take away jobs, whether it could be accountants or it could be some other professions. That the AI discussion, I think, is a fascinating one when it comes to this personnel issue.
Yeah, certainly. I do think there will be some displacement. I think we see that always with technology. But what's funny is when you look at over time, and there was an interesting article that did this, where it just looked at the constant quotes from, the 1900s on of technology replacing everyone. There's always this fear, and certainly there will be displacement. But I think a lot of times financial and general journalists and just everyone in society probably underestimate the increase in productivity rather than just straight replacement. There certainly will be some replacement, but for those business and professional services, I think it's more of working with the tool side by side and freeing you up for more intense analytical work rather than some of the grunt work that takes up a lot of our times.
Right. And I think, I've been with the society for 18 years, and every time a new technology comes around, they're afraid it's going to eliminate accounting positions. I'm sure when the electronic calculator was introduced, they probably said it was going to eliminate accounting positions. So I think it's going to be interesting to see the whole thing come together. Just back to inflation for a moment. We did ask our members what would be the 3 most helpful governmental steps for businesses over the next 12 months. And not surprisingly, implementing measures to ease inflation came out on top. Are there steps the federal government or states can take at this point to help with inflation? You mentioned what the Fed was doing, but is there anything else that could be done, or does it just have to kind of work itself out?
I think it's probably more the working itself out as the solution. I do think in some cases where there are bottlenecks in terms of the supply chain, states can probably help to encourage maybe some of those logistics and warehouse centers, right? Whether you're talking about some sort of permits or tax breaks, whatever it may be, because we are seeing that e-commerce rise in a significant way, right? So people are buying all throughout the week rather than the weekends, right? So if we're thinking about, we're dealing with the cost of goods being too high because we simply can't get those goods from one part of the country to the other, and making sure that there's some room from a land perspective for some of those logistics centers to deliver people goods, that helps push the cost down. But I do think in general, inflation largely is a macroeconomic phenomenon, and it's more up to the Federal Reserve and the federal government rather than individual state governments. And again, I think it's largely going to rest with the Federal Reserve because there isn't, kind of given the partisanship in Washington and the split government, there's unlikely to be, I would argue, really significant legislation that can tilt the inflation picture one way or the other. It's going to be more the Fed with a rather blunt tool of dampening demand, impacting consumer and business decisions, basically raising rates to a point where if you're a business or consumer, saving is really attractive and a better option than either consuming or investing. And that's going to push demand and subsequently prices down.
Okay. Well, let's take the discussion down to a state level, to New Jersey. Each year, we ask our members in public practice if they've ever advised an individual client living in New Jersey to consider relocation due to the state's high cost of living. It's a question we ask to tackle that out-migration debate. So this year, 67% of respondents said yes, they had advised the client to leave or relocate out of New Jersey due to the high cost of living. And the number has been as high as 75% in previous surveys. Is this idea of out-migration, is that something that economists or rating agencies look at when they evaluate the health of a state's economy?
Certainly. I mean, when you think about the potential for the tax base to be reduced, right? I mean, that's going to be a key part of the budget and the kind of outlook. I will say New Jersey, we live in such really an excellent and interesting state, right? In terms of our proximity to New York and the kind of gravity that has in terms of tremendous dollars. So on one hand, you are seeing that migration out, that kind of net migration, where I believe New Jersey, as of a couple months ago, year over year, lost about 30,000 people. So, a decent amount when you think about that kind of net migration, people leaving. Well, I will say, though, it is more of a national trend, right? We certainly have our challenges here in New Jersey, but when you look at the national trends, it's pretty consistent what we're seeing, which is that people, particularly in this new work from home environment, are moving towards places that are warmer and that have lower cost of living. It's not just a New Jersey thing. You're seeing in New York, Boston, et cetera. People are moving to Las Vegas, parts of California that are cheaper, Texas and Florida, of course. What's interesting, though, is when you look at home prices, right, and kind of year over year home price in New Jersey, you're still up north of 4%, whereas someplace like Florida that's seen as this darling, only up about 1.5%. The other thing, too, in terms of economic growth is it's not just that you want people moving, but you want people moving there of working age. I think one of the things that might be a challenge for Florida going forward is a number of the people moving are not necessarily of working age. They're going to retire, they're consuming less. Not great for your economic outlook. You really need people that are prime working age, that are driving the economic growth of the state, and also who are consuming and investing more. So I do think that's something that's kind of a wrinkle that maybe is underappreciated there. But without a doubt, the net migration will be a key factor for policymakers going forward. But again, I still think we benefit, from some of that work from home that will not go away, where people in New York can come here for relatively cheaper cost of living, not cheap nationally, but still relatively cheaper. And the fact that, we have certain advantages like an extremely strong school system.
Right. And who knows, the new congestion pricing plan in New York, it might drive companies and people back across the Hudson into New Jersey.
Yep, absolutely. And we've already seen that a little bit, the past couple of years, Don, where maybe not as much the client-facing or investment personnel, but some of the operations for large finance firms certainly moving to Jersey, whether it's the suburbs or Jersey City. And quite frankly, it's pretty attractive for folks in those roles where they don't have to commute all the way into New York City.
Yeah. And I can say, as far as my own retirement goes, I recently got back from Phoenix, where it was 101 degrees at 8 o'clock at night. So I will not be out migrating to Phoenix, Arizona when I retire. That's just not for me.
Yeah, you and me both. That is way too hot.
Yeah. All right. Well, Roosevelt, thank you. It's always a pleasure having you. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I always appreciate it, Don. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for listening and watching. To see more about the survey results, visit njcpa.org/hub/economy. And to learn more about Bernstein Private Wealth Management, visit bernstein.com.